Have you ever wondered why your intelligence unsettles men? Why the more you think, the less you seem to be desired? Why your questions, your independence, your refusal to play dumb causes men, especially modern men, to withdraw, become defensive, or label you as too much? Soren Kierkegaard once wrote, "The most common form of despair is not being who you are." But you think, you question, you refuse to shrink, and that is precisely the problem. You are not threatening because you are aggressive. You are threatening because you refuse to be diminished. And in a world where many men have been conditioned to find their worth through being needed, the intelligent woman becomes a crisis simply by existing. Most men aren't prepared to confront a woman who doesn't need them to explain the world to her. They rely on being the teacher, the provider of insight, the one who opens jars and opens minds. But you already know. You've read the books, formed your opinions, built your own life. You force men to question what they bring to the table when their table-setting skills are no longer required. That discomfort rattles them because when you refuse to play small, when you choose to be rather than to need, you remind them that their value can't be measured by how much smaller you make yourself. You become a mirror, not one that reflects their competence, but one that reveals their insecurities. And that, for many, is unbearable. Modern masculinity is built on utility, on being the solution to someone else's problem. But your very presence breaks that framework. Your refusal to seek validation, to ask for help you don't need, to pretend ignorance for the sake of his ego, that's what makes you dangerous. Not because you harm, but because you expose the fragility of confidence built on someone else's dependence. Modern relationships often function on an unspoken contract. She needs, he provides, and both feel valuable. But the intelligent woman, she's allergic to that transaction. She questions why love should require her to play helpless. She notices the performance in men's eyes when they rush to fix problems she never asked them to solve. She sees the discomfort when she knows more about the wine, the stock market, or the route home. And Kierkegaard understood this deeply. He wrote about the crowd being untruth, but he also understood that when a woman refuses to disappear into someone else's narrative, when she insists on her own intellectual sovereignty, she breaks the entire framework that many men depend on to feel masculine. Men don't fear intelligent women because they're intimidated by their minds. They fear intelligent women because they can't rescue them. Because the intelligent woman doesn't need a hero. She needs an equal. She doesn't want to be saved from her ignorance or lifted from her circumstances. She wants to be met in her fullness. And most men have been raised to provide solutions, not to receive wholeness. When she speaks with authority, when she corrects a misconception, when she knows the answer before he does, it doesn't make her arrogant. It makes him unnecessary. At least that's how it feels to a man whose identity is wrapped up in being the smarter, stronger, more capable one in the room. This is why intelligent women often find themselves alone. Not because they're unlovable, but because they're uncontainable. They won't pretend confusion to make him feel smart. They won't feign helplessness to make him feel strong. They won't dim their light so his can appear brighter. Kierkegaard wrote extensively about the concept of despair, but not as most people understand it. He called it the sickness unto death, a person being unaware that they are estranged from their true self. And that is what modern dating culture fears most, that women might wake up from the performance, that they might stop pretending to need rescue and start demanding partnership. Because a conscious woman cannot be managed through patronizing explanations or protective gestures. A conscious woman is no longer driven by the need to be chosen. She's driven by the need to be understood. And when a woman stops needing to be chosen, and starts expecting to be met as an intellectual equal, she becomes free. And when a woman becomes free, she becomes threatening to any system built on her dependence. Ask yourself, why do you feel like you have to apologize for knowing things? Why do you sense that men become uncomfortable when you speak with confidence about subjects they assumed were theirs? It's because most men, especially in this ego-driven world, derive their romantic value from being needed. But the intelligent woman, she derives her value from being whole. And wholeness in a woman makes many men feel unnecessary. To live without intellectual honesty is to sleep through your own brilliance. Most women have been trained to do exactly that, not because they lack intelligence, but because they were conditioned to hide it. Trained to ask questions they already know the answers to. Trained to seek opinions from men on topics they've mastered. Trained to fear their own depth because it made others, particularly romantic partners, uncomfortable. But when you become conscious, when you begin to speak what you know, when you stop performing confusion to make him feel wise, you become a mirror. And most men aren't ready to see what that mirror reflects, that their confidence was built on your voluntary ignorance. A conscious woman threatens every dynamic built on intellectual inequality. She doesn't laugh at jokes that aren't funny just to make him feel amusing. She doesn't pretend his basic observations are revolutionary insights. She doesn't nod along when he explains concepts she learned years ago. She listens, but she also responds. And this responding, this intellectual reciprocity, unnerves those who were comfortable being the only voice that mattered. Because once you stop playing student to every man who wants to be your teacher, you expose those who mistake lecturing for conversation. Once you stop seeking validation for thoughts you've already validated through your own research and experience, you reveal those addicted to being the fountain of wisdom. Once you no longer fear being called too smart or too intense, you cannot be diminished. This is what Kierkegaard meant when he spoke of despair. It's not just suffering, it's the ignorance of who you are. It's playing the role of the eager student, the grateful recipient of male wisdom, the woman who is perpetually impressed by basic competence, for so long that you forget you were brilliant before you learned to hide it. And when you finally stop hiding, it's not applause you want, it's reciprocity. You want a conversation, not a lecture. You want collaboration, not correction. You want to be seen as an intellectual equal, not as a beautiful mind that needs constant guidance. Kierkegaard said, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." And intelligent women do live forward, but they are always analyzing, understanding, seeing through the structures that keep them small. So what happens when a woman is no longer willing to play small? When she stops being enchanted by the game of intellectual hide and seek? She becomes unmanageable, not because she's difficult, but because she's whole. And that wholeness threatens the entire economy of modern dating, where female neediness is currency and intellectual dependency is mistaken for feminine charm. Kierkegaard knew this intimately. He wrestled with his own relationship to Regina Olsen, ultimately choosing his intellectual and spiritual journey over conventional romantic expectations. He understood that to live authentically sometimes means rejecting the roles society assigns, even if it costs you love itself. To be intellectually whole in a world that profits from your confusion is to become a problem. When you stop pretending not to understand, they call you condescending. When you don't ask for help you don't need, they call you independent to a fault. When you stop performing gratitude for basic respect, they say you're impossible to please. But you haven't changed. You've awakened. And the awakened woman can't go back to playing dumb. She sees how modern relationships are often built not on mutual respect, but on complementary inadequacies. She sees how a man might test her not out of curiosity but out of a need to establish intellectual dominance. She sees how knowledge, once celebrated in women, has been repackaged as a threat to masculine confidence. So what does she do? She continues to grow, not out of defiance, but out of respect for her own mind and for what love should be. She is not here to be a student forever. She is not here to be impressed by the bare minimum. She is here to think, to know, to contribute, not just to receive wisdom like it's charity. This is why many brilliant women find themselves misunderstood. When they walk away from relationships that require their intellectual submission, it's not arrogance, it's self-preservation. They refuse to sacrifice their curiosity on the altar of male comfort. Women, listen closely. The more intelligent you become, the more alone you may feel in romantic spaces. That is not failure. It's the price of refusing to shrink. You scare men not because you are unkind, but because you are unmanaged. And a woman who cannot be intellectually managed cannot be romantically controlled. Most men aren't looking for a partner. They're looking for an admiring audience. They want you to serve a role. The impressed listener, the grateful student, the woman who makes them feel brilliant simply by existing in their proximity. But the intelligent woman steps outside of those roles. And when she does, she becomes invisible to those still trapped in the dynamic of teacher and perpetual pupil. And that invisibility isn't loneliness, it's freedom. You no longer exist to make someone else feel smart. You're no longer performing wonder at basic observations. You're building your own intellectual life, and it only includes those capable of meeting you there. But here's what no one tells you. Most men fear the woman who doesn't need their explanations because she represents everything they were told women weren't supposed to be. Self-sufficient, intellectually curious, unimpressed by authority that hasn't earned respect. These aren't flaws in you. They're failures in a system that taught men their value came from being indispensable to someone who was supposed to need them. You don't exist to be his student. You don't exist to be his project. You are not broken and in need of his insights to become whole. You are a complete person seeking another complete person for the kind of connection that can only happen between equals. This is why when you walk into a room and speak with authority, when you disagree with confidence, when you know things without having been taught them by the men present, people begin to fidget. Not because you did something wrong, but because your presence says, I am not here to be impressed, I am not here to be educated, I am here to engage. And that level of intellectual equality is terrifying to those who built their romantic identity on being the smarter one. Kierkegaard called this the leap of faith, to leave the security of roles and expectations and walk into authentic relationship, to love truth more than comfort, to choose genuine connection over the false intimacy of intellectual inequality. And that leap will cost you. It will eliminate men who need you to be smaller, but it will also connect you with the rare ones who see your intelligence not as competition, but as gift. Because once you've tasted real intellectual partnership, once you've been met by someone who celebrates rather than diminishes your mind, you can never go back to relationships built on your voluntary ignorance. And your intelligence, if rooted in self-respect and not just information, will transform you from a woman who seeks approval for her thoughts into a woman who thinks freely and loves only those brave enough to think alongside her. That's not just personal growth, that's revolutionary. And most people don't want revolution. They want the familiar comfort of traditional roles, even if those roles require half the population to pretend they know less than they do. But when you take that leap, when you stop editing your intelligence for someone else's comfort, you begin to hear your own voice clearly. And that voice asks hard questions. Who are you really when you're not performing intellectual modesty? Have you been thinking or just agreeing? Are you here to be chosen for your compliance or to be loved for your mind? And when you finally dare to answer honestly, you realize why most people run from intellectual authenticity. Because once you touch it, you can never go back to relationships that require you to play dumb. The intelligent woman who embraces this doesn't just change her dating life, she changes the geometry of her entire existence. She doesn't revolve around men's egos or society's comfort with her intelligence. She orbits truth. She moves with intellectual integrity. She suffers through loneliness with dignity rather than surrender her mind for companionship. Yes, the leap is terrifying, but it is the price of true intellectual alignment. And you'll find that the more you dare to be brilliant, the more the universe begins to send you people who can handle your light. Kierkegaard once said, "To dare is to lose one's footing momentarily. Not to dare is to lose oneself." And most women have already lost themselves, not because they lack intelligence, but because they've been trained to apologize for it. You were told to soften your certainty, to phrase your knowledge as questions, to defer to male expertise even in areas where you excel. You were taught to be curious in ways that made men feel wise, but never so knowledgeable that you made them feel unnecessary. But that acceptance, the kind that demands you hide your intelligence, is not love. It's assimilation. And the intelligent woman who refuses to assimilate becomes a threat not just to insecure men, but to everyone who profits from her intellectual silence. You scare them not because you are arrogant, but because you are accurate. Because when you speak, your words carry the weight of actual knowledge. Because when you challenge an idea, it's not from ignorance seeking enlightenment, but from understanding seeking truth. You were never meant to be the silent audience in a room full of voices, but that's what the world demands. That you listen more than you speak, that you admire more than you contribute, that you seek wisdom from those who may know less than you do, simply because society told you their opinions matter more. From a young age, you were told to be sweet, but what they really meant was, be smaller, be impressed, don't know too much, don't speak with too much authority, don't reveal that you can see through the intellectual posturing that passes for depth in most conversations. And if you dared to correct someone, if you said the thing that revealed you'd been thinking long before they started explaining, you were met with surprise, or worse, with the kind of smile that barely concealed irritation. Why? Because people don't fear the loud. They fear the right. They fear the woman who knows what she's talking about, who doesn't need their explanation, who commands intellectual respect without asking for it. That kind of woman, you, becomes a mirror. And most people spend their lives avoiding mirrors that reflect anything other than their own assumptions about female intellectual capacity. You're not difficult. You're not intimidating. You're just no longer manageable through condescension. And when a woman stops being intellectually manageable, she becomes either unforgettable or unbearable, depending on how deeply others are committed to their own illusions about gender and intelligence. The truth is, if your intelligence unsettles people, that's not your problem. That's their awakening beginning to sting. Most people don't want intellectual partnership. They want intellectual hierarchy with themselves comfortably on top. But the intelligent woman dismantles hierarchy wherever she goes, especially in love. Because love, for her, is not about being taught or rescued or completed by someone else's knowledge. Love is about meeting another complete mind and building something neither could create alone. That's why you feel resistance. That's why you're met with confusion, even hostility. Because your presence threatens the system that rewards female intellectual submission. You don't defer when you know better. You don't ask permission to be smart. You don't explain yourself endlessly just to be accepted as competent. You think, therefore you are dangerous. Not to individuals, but to the structures that depend on your voluntary ignorance. In a world addicted to intellectual inequality, your competence feels like a foreign language. People mistake your knowledge for arrogance. They confuse your independence for coldness. But that's only because they've been conditioned to interpret female intelligence as aggression rather than gift. The truth is, most people mistake being needed for being loved. They want the dependency, the questions, the wide-eyed appreciation for basic competence. Not the woman who meets them as an equal, who contributes rather than just receives, who offers her own insights instead of constant admiration for theirs. You don't love with neediness. You love with curiosity. You want intellectual partnership, not intellectual charity. And that alone makes you dangerous in a dating culture built on complementary inadequacies rather than shared strength. If you found this message valuable, don't let it end here. Like and share it with another brilliant woman who's tired of playing small. Subscribe for more wisdom they don't teach you about navigating intelligence in a world that fears it. And if you want to support content that celebrates rather than diminishes female brilliance, click the link in the description. Your mind matters, your thoughts matter, and your refusal to shrink for someone else's comfort, that matters most of all.